Hideo Kojima. Some people like him, others not so much. If you're watching this video, chances are you already know who he is and what he's all about. Ambitious games that take inspiration from his favorite movies. When Kojima's name comes up in conversation, Metal Gear Solid usually is the first thing that comes to mind, which makes sense as it's his most popular brainchild and led him to be known as the movie game guy. Not to be confused with the other movie game guy. But even before the first Metal Gear Solid was released, blasting him into video game stardom, he was doing his thing in the 80s on Microsoft's MSX, directing some pretty innovative games such as Penguin Adventure and one of the earliest stealth games to be released, Metal Gear. It was after this that he really came into his element and released his first cinematic game experience, Snatcher. So it is 1987 after the first Metal Gear game has been released to critical acclaim. With a quick pat on the back, Kojima looks into what he wants his next project to be, and of course, because of his personal interest in film, he looked to some of his favorite movies with hopes that they would inspire him. Blade Runner in particular would plant the idea of a cyberpunk setting that would serve as the basis for Snatcher. And I guess the story too. Snatcher is practically Blade Runner the game 10 years before the actual Blade Runner game was released. It stars Gillian Seed, an amnesiac who has recently become a junker, a special agent whose job is to find and eliminate Snatchers, humanoid robots that kill and replace people all over Neo-Kobe City. He does this in hopes that by hunting down Snatchers he could regain his memories. On his first day on the job, he finds the corpse of a fellow junker, Gibson, who happened to be hot on the trail of all this Snatcher shiz, and was killed for knowing too much. Along with his sidekick Metal Gear, Gillian decides to avenge Gibson by picking up where he left off, uncovering secrets, evading death, and getting to know lots of friendly and not so friendly peeps along the way. You are a detective doing detective things. When you're not blasting Snatchers, you are investigating crime scenes, researching suspects, chasing leads, and interviewing witnesses. This is most of what goes on in this game, and it really goes a long way in making the game as immersive as possible. It doesn't feel like you're watching the story unfold from a distance, but like you're really Gillian running around the mean streets of Neo-Kobe City trying to hunt down Snatchers with your bare hands. Or a gun, I guess. I've played a lot of video games in my relatively short life, and not many has been able to suck me in the same way this one has. Now I know Kojima took quite a lot from Blade Runner, not only the setting but also most of the plot and to some extent the main character, and even though it's very derivative, I do find Snatcher much more entertaining than Blade Runner. Don't crucify me for this, but I found Blade Runner to be super boring. It's a cool movie visually, but I don't know if it's the pacing or just the fact that none of the characters are interesting to me, but I struggled to stay awake during that movie. I recognize that it is in fact a good movie and it has some crazy influence that could still be felt in media coming out today, but it's just not for me. I feel like Snatcher, on the other hand, took what it had and only improved upon it, in a way that would make it more enjoyable, to me at least. The characters are a hell of a lot more interesting and likable for the most part. It's definitely less of a MC versus the world feeling, and more of a the friends we made along the way. Napoleon, Random, Metal Gear, and a few others all do their part in helping Gillian on his mission, and he wouldn't get very far without them. These aren't characters that feel like they were just thrown in to move the plot forward. They have distinct personalities and motives unique to them, and it helps that there's often banter between Gillian and the rest of the cast that sometimes wanders off into camp territory. Moments like these help the characters feel somewhat real. It makes me want to hear everything everyone has to say, going out of my way to try and discover optional events where Gillian and Metal Gear talk about something really dumb for way longer than they need to, and I would gladly listen to every bit of it knowing damn well the proper way of eating a Neo-Kobe pizza has nothing to do with cyberpunk invasion of the body snatchers. The writing is very charming to say the least, and this left a great impression on me. On this channel, I have been very vocal about my distaste for adventure games, and Snatcher happens to be a very rare exception. I couldn't tell you exactly how it makes the genre work for me, but I'm glad it does. And thankfully, I experienced the Sega CD version of the game, which I would assume is a lot more charming than the MSX original, with the addition of voice acting and more animation to make the city of Neo Kobe seem livelier. There's also the fact that the original Snatcher ended with a huge cliffhanger, one that wouldn't be resolved until the next title in the franchise. Snatcher was released to very positive reviews, but also suffered from poor sales, and like other media that gets welcomed with a similar reception, it garnered a cult following, which I guess was enough for Konami to allow it to be remade as an RPG that would be released just 2 years later. It would have brand new characters and locations for you to take Gillian, and best of all would add the third and final act to the game. So this game was a must for anyone who played and enjoyed the original game, as they could now finally experience the story in full, making SD Snatcher the definitive version to experience the Snatcher story until the CD versions were released, starting with the PC Engine Super CD-ROM in '92. Meanwhile, in the land of windmills and cheese, there was a group of like-minded individuals who were about to make video game history. Oasis is the name, and translating games is the game. That didn't work as well as I wanted it to. But yes, games have been translated and localized before, obviously, but up until this point they had only been done by official video game developers, usually by the same companies that created them. Oasis would be the first group that would change that, and SD Snatcher would be the first game to get a fan translation patch, essentially kickstarting a community of bilingual game enthusiasts who just want to make their favorite video games more accessible to others. So rather than a remake, I would consider SD Snatcher to be more of a reimagining of Snatcher. Of course, they both have the same story and setting, but they are wildly different in the way they play, which should be expected, as you can't just go from an adventure game to a JRPG without changing some things. Plot-wise, SD Snatcher follows all the major plot beats from the original Snatcher, but everything in between has been scrambled up, altered, and appended. Yes, finding Gibson's body still kicks off this game, but instead of being called as backup, you are actually sent to the abandoned factory with Gibson in order to investigate Snatcher activity. And not only in the factory, but the surrounding pier and warehouses. You're separated, but stay in contact the whole mission up until his death. Sure, the events are a bit out of order in a way that changes how one would interpret the Snatcher's plan. Instead of the bomb being used to cover up what went down, it kinda seems like a failed attempt at killing Gibson, forcing the Snatcher to come and finish the job himself. You are watching everything unfold, rather than arriving to the scene of the crime after the fact and putting the pieces together like you do in Snatcher, which works for the type of game this is. There's a bunch of little alterations like that throughout the game, which puts being in the action first rather than focusing on the investigation aspects of the original game. And on top of these, there are also larger additions to the story, the most notable being the part where Gillian has to infiltrate a cult that worships Snatchers. He ends up losing his junker license during this and has his own little redemption arc where he has to clear his name, which unfortunately doesn't make it to the versions released after this game. It's honestly my favorite part about it. I appreciate the attempt to make the story fresh for returning fans. I would be a tad bored if I had to make my way through the exact same story stretched out for 15 hours just so that I could find out how it ends, especially with the way the gameplay is handled. So, in the JRPG version of Snatcher, there are tons of battles, believe it or not. And it isn't just Snatchers you'll be taking down. Most of them happen to be these little robots. These cute and deadly little robots. They all prance around the screen until you run into one. Then it's time to battle and you move to a first-person view for the fight. From here, you would probably assume that this would play out like Dragon Quest, for example, where you use the menu to select which enemy you want to attack and that's that. But it's actually a pretty innovative battle system, especially for its time. It's basically VATS from Fallout as a JRPG. You have a variety of weapons to choose from, each with their own AoE, speed, damage, and projectile type. You get to carry 3 at a time, so it's best to pick the ones that would work best against the enemies you'll be facing in a particular dungeon, rather than the 3 guns that have the highest damage stat. You can target different parts on the enemy's body in order to lower their stats. The stats you lower all depends on the part you shoot. So if Robo-Boy is whooping your ass with a powerful gun, you could aim it at its weapon in order to lower its attack or even destroy it so it can't shoot anymore. Or perhaps you could shoot it in its camera eye so its accuracy goes down and it has a harder time hitting you. It's not just the stats that could be eliminated with precise aim, some enemies even have antennas that they use to call for reinforcements. That would be the first thing you'd want to destroy so that you're not stuck in an endless battle. Unfortunately, things don't always go as planned, and enemies have a habit of moving out of the way, causing you to miss your target and in some cases miss the enemy entirely, and this can get extremely annoying at times. Besides the guns, there are also side weapons you can use on the enemy and drugs to heal yourself. The drugs are absolutely necessary and I love them very much. I don't have a drug problem, you do. The side weapons on the other hand are really fucking lame. Except for the bombs that damage everything on the screen. Those things are amazing. You can buy both from Junker HQ, which you will be visiting frequently in order to purchase new weapons and ammo from your boy Harry, and drugs from Jamie, who is now working for Junker HQ as a doctor alongside the only other friendly robot besides Metal Gear and Little John. Outside of combat, there really isn't much to do other than moving from plot point to plot point, and failing to avoid the 8 million enemies between them. Like, there is an ungodly amount of enemies you have to go through at any given moment in the game, and they're just constantly spawning. I think this is the only time where I can say I would rather just have random encounters over roaming enemies, and it doesn't help that each battle takes about 7 years to finish. After the first hour or so of playing, I grew into the habit of putting fast forward on and turning on auto battle. The enemies pretty much act the same every battle, so in most cases there really isn't any point in paying attention after the first time. And it's pretty unfortunate that the game suffers from too many fucking battles, make it stop, I just want to enjoy the story syndrome, because the battle system is pretty cool, but it just gets run into the ground with the endless stream of enemies that won't get the hell out of your way and how slow the combat is. I mean, I recognize that a lot of older RPGs had a similar problem, and it's a product of its time, but man do I hate it with all my heart. It really got in the way of me fully enjoying this game. So Snatcher is an okay game for what it is. Do I believe it holds up to the original source material? Absolutely not. Snatcher is leagues ahead of this game in pretty much every way, but I do appreciate that it attempts to complete the story while also giving a new experience for fans so they wouldn't have to buy the same game twice to get the ending. I low-key wish that it would be more common for developers to straight up remake popular games into totally different genres, though I'm sure not every aspect can be translated over as shown with this game. I think it would still be interesting enough to get my attention. Even though Snatcher isn't something I would recommend to someone, it still has an important place in video game history thanks to the efforts of Oasis, single-handedly starting a community of fan translators, constantly making more and more awesome games playable for folks outside of Japan, and I think that's pretty cool. Recently we got a Racing Lagoon and Devil Children Black Book fan translations. These are games I've been waiting to play for years and had no chance of getting translated or even re-released by the developers, so trust me when I say, I absolutely adore the fan translation community.